The man always wondered why the floor in his house was colder than in other rooms. But one day, he noticed something strange and decided to check the floorboards. What he found under the floor changed his life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. When Marcus first set foot inside the old house that now legally belonged to him, he felt an odd mixture of pride and unease. Pride, because the property had once been the cherished possession of his grandfather, a man who had worked his entire life in the mines and, through sheer persistence, had managed to buy and keep a modest home on the edge of a small town. Unease, because the house, though sturdy and well-built, seemed to breathe with the weight of its own history. It creaked at odd times, gave off smells of earth and dust that did not always make sense, and seemed to observe Marcus just as much as he was observing it. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. There were trees lining the narrow road and a small creek running not far behind the property. The house stood alone with no immediate neighbors, just the skeletons of older barns and sheds collapsing into the ground around it. For Marcus, who had grown weary of the noise and constant vigilance of city life, it was an appealing refuge. After a messy divorce and years of dead-end jobs, the inheritance felt like a second chance. He told himself this would be the place to start over, a chance to breathe without judgment, to build something resembling peace. But from the very beginning, something about the place unsettled him. The first evening he moved in, carrying boxes through the narrow hallway, he noticed how the floor beneath his feet was strikingly cold. It wasn't just that the wood was old. It was as though the boards themselves carried a permanent chill, the kind that seeped into his socks and crawled up his legs. It was different from the floors in the bedroom or living room, which felt warm and neutral. The hallway, however, seemed to hum with an invisible draft, a clamminess that never went away. At first, Marcus laughed it off, joking to himself that every old house had its quirks. Perhaps poor insulation, perhaps air trap between the beams, perhaps something to do with the foundation. Yet, as the days passed, the strange coldness remained. Even when the sun had baked the yard outside into a brittle, dry yellow, and heat waves shimmered over the asphalt of the road, stepping onto that stretch of floor gave Marcus the impression of standing on a slab of stone buried deep underground. More unsettling, however, were the faint noises. They were never loud, never clear enough to define. At night, lying in bed with the window cracked open, Marcus would hear something soft and rhythmic, like a creak followed by a pause, then another. Sometimes it sounded like wood flexing, sometimes like distant footsteps. He told himself it was the house settling, or maybe rodents scurrying through hidden walls, but the pattern gnawed at him. The noises often came from the direction of the hallway beneath the cold floorboards. Weeks passed, and Marcus fell into a routine. He repaired minor leaks, adjusted squeaky hinges, painted parts of the porch, and tried to make the house feel more like his own. Yet, alongside this sense of productivity, he could not shake the feeling that the place had a presence independent of him. The air in the hallway always carried a damp heaviness, as if the house was holding its breath. Sometimes, walking through in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, he felt a prickle rise on his skin, a whisper of being watched. It was then that he began noticing the smaller oddities. A loaf of bread he was sure had been untouched seemed lighter one morning, as though a slice was missing. A carton of milk felt a little emptier than it should. One night he left a plate drying on the counter, only to find it the next morning in the sink with faint smears as though someone had eaten from it. He checked and rechecked his memory, even scribbling notes on a pad to remind himself of what he had done the day before. The notes confirmed it. Food was vanishing without his hand ever touching it. He tried to rationalize, tried to cling to the simplest answers. Perhaps he had forgotten. Perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps fatigue blurred his recollection. But Marcus was not a careless man. Years of working with engines and tools had drilled a certain attentiveness into him. He was not someone who misplaced things easily. Each new small discrepancy chipped away at the fragile sense of security he was trying to build in this house. Then came the night when he woke up and saw the flickering glow of the television from the living room. His stomach dropped. He had not turned it on before going to bed, and the remote was still on the nightstand beside him. He padded cautiously down the hall, heart hammering, only to find the screen lit with static and white noise. The room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, though Marcus hadn't smoked a day in his life. He turned the set off, checked the locks on the front door and windows, and went back to bed. But sleep eluded him until the pale light of dawn crept through the curtains. The following week brought more of the same. One afternoon, he came home from the auto shop and found the back door slightly ajar. Another time, he discovered an apple core tossed carelessly into the trash bin, though he hadn't eaten an apple in days. At first, he suspected some local kids sneaking in as a prank. He walked the property, inspected the shed, even called an old friend in town to ask if there had been reports of trespassing. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of forced entry. And yet, the house seemed to rearrange itself in small but undeniable ways whenever Marcus let his guard down. Gradually, his unease turned into suspicion. He began to wonder if someone else was, in fact, sharing the house with him. Someone who moved silently. Someone who used only what they needed and left just enough evidence to keep him questioning his sanity. It was a disturbing thought, but the alternative, that he was losing his mind, forgetting entire actions, misplacing entire hours, was perhaps worse. On more than one occasion, Marcus considered packing up and leaving, but where would he go? This house was his inheritance, his chance to build something for himself. To abandon it would feel like betraying his grandfather's memory, like giving in to fears without answers. No, he told himself, he had to stay. He had to uncover what was happening here, and he had to prove, one way or another, that the house was not playing tricks on him. As summer drew deeper into August, the nights grew heavier, more humid, and the air inside the home thickened. The cold in the hallway remained unchanged, untouched by the season. Each time Marcus crossed it barefoot, he felt as though he were trespassing over a secret he was not meant to know. And in his gut, he began to sense that the house was holding something from him, something beneath that frozen stretch of wood. The thought festered. It crept into his sleep, twisted into his dreams. He would imagine a hollow space beneath the boards, a hidden cavity where the air shifted and whispered. Sometimes, half asleep, he thought he could hear breathing, slow and steady, rising from the floor. He would wake, drenched in sweat, pulse pounding, staring at the shadowed ceiling of his bedroom while the silence pressed down around him. By the time September's first rains began to fall, Marcus was no longer able to dismiss what he felt. The house was not empty. Something, or someone, was with him, and though he did not yet know how or why, he knew the cold floor of the hallway was not just a quirk of old construction. It was a warning, a threshold beneath which answers waited in the dark. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at Marcus during those first weeks grew heavier as summer deepened into September. The house was no longer merely strange. It felt inhabited, as though the walls themselves were aware of his presence and responded in subtle ways. What had started with cold floorboards and missing food soon escalated into occurrences that were impossible to explain away. Each day brought something new, something that made the possibility of coincidence less believable. One night, long after midnight, Marcus awoke to a glow seeping faintly under his bedroom door. For a few seconds, he thought he had left a lamp on in the hallway, but as his grogginess faded, he realized the light flickered. Carefully, he rose from bed, his body stiff with dread, and cracked the door open. From the living room at the far end of the hall came the unmistakable glow of the television. He had turned it off before going to bed, he was certain of it. The remote lay exactly where he always left it, on the nightstand beside him, yet the familiar static buzz hummed through the house. When Marcus entered the living room, the air smelled faintly of something acrid, like stale smoke. His pulse quickened. He pressed the button on the set, silenced it, and stood staring into the dim reflection of his own face in the darkened screen, unable to shake the feeling that someone else had just been in the room and had slipped away moments before his arrival. Another evening, when he returned home from work at the auto shop, he discovered the back door unlatched. He had locked it that morning, he was absolutely sure. Yet now it swung lightly in the breeze as if mocking him. He examined the ground outside, but rain had washed away any chance of footprints. Still, the wrongness of it made him nauseous. He searched the house with a wrench in his hand, opening every closet, every cabinet, even peering under the bed like a child afraid of monsters. Nothing. And yet the thought followed him like a shadow. Someone was here. Someone who knew how to slip in and out without leaving a trace. Food disappeared more noticeably. It was not just an apple or slice of bread anymore. Sometimes an entire package of cold meat seemed half gone overnight, or the leftover stew he had saved in the fridge vanished completely. Once, he placed 3 eggs in a bowl and left them on the counter before going to bed, planning to make breakfast the next morning. When he awoke, only 2 remained, and the shell of the third lay cracked open in the trash, yolk smeared along its edge as if someone had fried it and eaten it in silence while he slept just a few rooms away. Marcus's sleep grew shallow, fractured by every creak and whisper of the old house. He began waking at the smallest sound, lying frozen in bed while his ears strained to distinguish what was real from imagination. Sometimes he thought he heard soft footsteps passing through the hall just beyond his door. Other nights, a faint click as if a cabinet had been opened. He told himself again and again that it was all tricks of the mind, that fatigue made him paranoid. But the evidence mounted until denial became impossible. The most chilling moment came one dawn when he shuffled into the kitchen and found the window above the sink open, rain dripping onto the sill. He never opened that window. It was stiff with age and difficult to push. But now it yawned wide, and the counter below it was dotted with muddy droplets, as though someone had climbed through. He stared at them, heart pounding, and followed the faint trail down onto the floor. The prints were smeared and difficult to read, but he was certain they were not his. They looked like bare feet. By this point, Marcus was certain there was an intruder, yet the lack of signs from outside confused him. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no signs of forced entry. Whoever entered his home did so with knowledge of its secrets, moving with care. The thought that someone had been inside while he slept filled him with both rage and terror. He felt stripped of safety, as though his very body was vulnerable in ways he could not control. At work, he was distracted, his hands trembling while he handled tools, his mind replaying images of strangers rifling through his cupboards, breathing the same air, watching him unseen. To fight back against this gnawing uncertainty, Marcus decided to keep records. Each night before bed, he wrote in a small notebook what food he had, what lights he had turned off, what windows he had closed, where he had placed certain objects. In the morning, he checked the entries against what he found. The results were undeniable. Items moved, food gone, towels damp. The notebook confirmed what his mind screamed. Someone else shared this house with him. Once, in desperation, he set a trap of sorts. He placed a fresh loaf of bread in the kitchen, balanced precariously so that even a light touch would cause it to topple. When he woke, the bread was on its side, a third of it missing, and the crumbs scattered as though someone had eaten quickly, furtively, before retreating. Another time he left a chair angled in such a way that anyone passing through the room would bump it. The next morning, the chair had been nudged just slightly to the side. The more Marcus proved the presence of another, the less peace he found. His mind spun endlessly with questions. Who was this person? Why his house? Why him? Were they dangerous or simply desperate? He found himself standing in the hallway some nights, staring down at the cold floorboards, wondering if the answers lay beneath. He even tapped along the boards once with his heel, listening to the hollow sound that echoed back, a resonance that hinted at empty space below. He quickly stopped, shaken by the thought of disturbing whatever might be down there. The exhaustion began to take a toll. His work suffered, his boss warning him to keep his mind on the cars instead of wandering in a haze. Marcus lied, claiming he had trouble sleeping because of allergies, but in truth it was fear. He feared closing his eyes, feared waking to find someone standing over him. He began locking his bedroom door, something he had never done before, and slept with a wrench under the pillow. And yet, no matter how vigilant he became, the disturbances persisted. The food continued to vanish. Objects still moved. The faint smells of smoke, of unwashed fabric, sometimes lingered in the air. His grandfather's house, once a symbol of stability, now felt like a cage he was forced to share with a phantom. At last, one night, he stood in the hallway, staring down at those clammy boards, and made a promise to himself. Whatever secrets the house held, whatever force or intruder was haunting his nights, he would uncover it. He would not live forever in fear, not in a home that should have been his sanctuary. He did not yet know how or when, but the cold floor beneath his feet seemed to challenge him, to whisper that the truth was waiting just below the surface. That whisper followed him to bed, into uneasy dreams where shadows moved freely through his rooms, where faceless strangers ate his food while he lay paralyzed. When he woke, drenched in sweat, the notebook on the nightstand was his only anchor to reality. The house was not empty. Something was inside with him, something that changed his home night after night, as though to remind him he was never truly alone. The notebook by his bed had become both a comfort and a curse. It proved to Marcus that he was not losing his mind, that the strange events unfolding inside the house were real and not hallucinations brought on by fatigue or paranoia. Yet, at the same time, each morning's comparison between what he had written the night before and what he discovered upon waking confirmed a truth that gnawed at his sanity. Someone was inside with him. He could not see them, could not catch them, but they were there, moving through his rooms with a kind of ghostly precision. For weeks the pattern persisted, and Marcus's nerves thinned like paper left too long in the sun. He had begun to dread the nights, to dread the moment when his head sank into the pillow because he knew it meant ceding control to the silence and whatever lurked within it. It was during one of these tense days, while rain lashed against the windows and the wind moaned through the trees, that the first real break in the mystery came. Marcus had been struggling with a leaking pipe under the sink for 2 days. The dripping drove him mad, each drop hitting the metal of the basin like a mocking metronome. He was no plumber, but waiting for a professional to arrive would take days, and he could not bear the idea of letting the leak ruin the already fragile boards beneath his kitchen floor. So he gathered his tools, rolled up his sleeves, and set about repairing it himself. The work was clumsy, his hands more accustomed to oil and engines than to the delicate fittings of plumbing. Yet it was not the pipe that gave him pause, but the floor itself. As he shifted his weight to reach further beneath the cabinet, one of the boards in the hallway beside him gave a low creak, softer and stranger than usual. He leaned back, placing his palm against it, and felt it lift ever so slightly under the pressure. Marcus frowned. He pressed again, and the board yielded, not snapping or cracking, but rising as though it had not been nailed down at all. For a long moment he simply knelt there, staring at the floor as the rain drummed its steady rhythm against the roof. A house as old as this one was bound to have quirks, but this felt different. This was deliberate. His chest tightened with a mix of dread and anticipation. Slowly, carefully, he slid his fingers into the seam and pulled. The board resisted at first, then gave way with a reluctant groan, revealing a shadowed gap beneath. Marcus's breath caught. It was not insulation or foundation he saw, not the simple voids between beams. Instead, there was space, and in that space, a narrow wooden staircase leading down into darkness. His first instinct was to cover it back up, to push the board into place and pretend he had seen nothing. The rational part of his mind whispered that some mysteries were better left alone, that if someone had been moving through his house unseen, perhaps this was their way in and out, and disturbing it might only draw their attention. But curiosity, that deep, gnawing need for answers that had been building with every vanished loaf of bread and every moved chair, overpowered his fear. He fetched a flashlight from the drawer, its beam flickering weakly, and positioned it above the opening. The light revealed only the top steps, worn and coated in dust. Beyond that was blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the glow whole. Marcus's hand trembled. He told himself he would only look, only peek far enough to confirm that the stairs led to a simple crawl space or old root cellar. Yet, as he lowered himself onto the first step, the chill that had always haunted the hallway rose around him like a wave. It seeped into his bones, cold and damp, as though he had already descended beneath the earth. Step by step, he went down, each board groaning under his weight. The air grew stale, carrying with it the smell of mildew and something older, something that reminded him of abandoned buildings from his childhood, places that felt left behind by time. At the bottom of the stairs, he swept the beam of the flashlight across the space and gasped. The room was larger than he expected, stretching farther than the foundation should have allowed. Old furniture slumped in the corners, a table, a couple of chairs, their surfaces thick with dust and draped in cobwebs. Shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of glass jars clouded with age, their contents long since unrecognizable. It was like stepping into another world, one hidden just beneath his feet, one that had been forgotten for decades, and yet not everything was forgotten. The flashlight caught on a shape in the corner, a bundle of fabric that at first looked like discarded cloth, but as Marcus approached, he realized it was a sleeping bag, old but recently used. Next to it sat a half-empty bottle of water and the crust of bread gone stale. His heart pounded. This was it. This was the proof. Someone was living here, beneath his home, just a few steps below where he slept at night. The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He lifted the beam higher, scanning the walls. The dust that covered everything was not uniform. In certain places it had been disturbed, brushed aside by hands or feet. On the table, amid the cobwebs, a ring was left clean where a cup had once rested. On the floor, faint trails suggested movement to and from the stairs. Marcus crouched and touched the prints, cold dread settling into his stomach. They were not animal tracks, not the scurrying of rodents. They were footprints, human footprints. For a long moment, he could only kneel there, paralyzed by the enormity of what he had uncovered. The missing food, the rearranged objects, the open window. It all made sense now. The intruder had not been breaking in from outside. They had been inside all along, moving up from this hidden space while he slept, using his home as though it were their own. The flashlight shook in his grip. Every instinct screamed at him to run back up the stairs, slam the board shut, and flee the house altogether. But he remained rooted, his mind racing with questions. Who was this person? How long had they been living here? Why had they chosen his grandfather's house? And, most pressing of all, were they still nearby, watching him even now from some shadowed corner of the room? The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Marcus turned in a slow circle, the beam cutting across the walls. In the farthest corner, he saw what looked like another opening, low to the ground and partially concealed by an old cabinet pushed haphazardly in front of it. The gap behind the furniture was dark, and when he crouched to look closer, he felt the faintest breath of air against his face. A tunnel. There was more beyond this room, a passage leading who knew where. His throat went dry. He backed away, careful not to make noise, and forced himself up the stairs, heart hammering with each step. When he finally pushed the board back into place and stood once again in the hallway, the house felt different. It was no longer merely old or quirky or haunted by memories. It was alive with a secret, one that tied directly to the strange disturbances that had plagued him. The cold under his feet was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. That night, Marcus did not sleep. He sat in his living room with the flashlight at his side, staring at the hallway where the hidden hatch lay concealed. He thought of the footprints in the dust, the stale bread, the signs of life carved into that forgotten chamber. His fear deepened into resolve. He could no longer dismiss what was happening as mere coincidence. The truth was there, beneath him, and sooner or later he would have to face it. Marcus sat awake for the remainder of that long night, the flashlight resting across his lap, his eyes never straying far from the hallway where the floorboard concealed the hatch. The knowledge of what lay beneath him poisoned the air in the house. No matter how many times he told himself he was safe, that the person who had been living there was likely asleep or gone, he could not escape the truth that he had uncovered. He had seen the footprints, the sleeping bag, the bottle of water. He had seen with his own eyes the evidence of life existing parallel to his, hidden just beneath his feet. The cold of the hallway now made sense. It was not some meaningless flaw of construction, not a draft from the foundation, but the faint breathing of the tunnel below, exhaling its secrets into his home. By the time dawn came, Marcus felt hollowed out, exhausted and jittery, yet unable to sleep. He brewed coffee he did not want, letting the bitter steam rise into his face as though it might burn away the unease. but nothing cleared it. Every sound became amplified, every creak in the wood reminding him that there was more to this house than met the eye. He found himself glancing at the hatch again and again, half expecting it to lift, half expecting to see a figure emerge into the hallway. Nothing happened, but the expectation alone was enough to gnaw at him. The following nights were worse. Now that he knew what existed beneath him, every disturbance took on a clarity he had been denying. The missing food was no longer a mystery. The moved chair no longer something he could dismiss as forgetfulness. Someone was moving through his home. The realization solidified into a grim pattern. The intruder was not breaking in from outside at all. They lived here, in his house, hidden in the chamber below, and when the world fell silent at night, they came up into the rooms Marcus believed were his own. He began to test this theory with a kind of grim determination. He would leave food on the counter deliberately, arranging it in ways that made tampering obvious. In the morning, the loaf of bread would be lighter, or a slice of cheese gone, or crumbs scattered where none had been before. Once, he left a can of beans at the edge of the table, perfectly balanced. When he returned the next morning, the can was gone entirely, and the faintest smudge of dirt stained the surface where it had been. Marcus knew then without doubt. The intruder was active when he slept, rising silently from the dark room below to take what they needed. The most disturbing discovery came not from food, but from the bathroom. Marcus had taken to showering late at night to calm his nerves, and one evening he left the towel draped across the rail to dry. The following morning, when he reached for it, it was already damp. Not damp from having dried overnight, but freshly wet, carrying the smell of soap. He stood there, frozen, clutching the towel in disbelief. Someone had been in his bathroom while he slept. Someone had used his water, his soap, his towel, and then returned to the dark hollow below, leaving Marcus with the evidence. The anger that filled him was sharp, but it was dulled by a deeper current of fear. This person, whoever they were, moved with such precision, such careful awareness, that Marcus had never once woken to the sound of them. They waited until his breathing deepened, until he was fully surrendered to sleep, and then they climbed into his world to take what they needed. The thought sickened him. His home, his sanctuary had become a stage for a secret play in which he was an unwitting actor. He began to imagine the rhythms of this other life, the hidden timetable of the night dweller. By day, while Marcus moved through the rooms above, the intruder slept in the chamber below, curled on the old mattress or in the sleeping bag, waiting for silence to fall. At night, when Marcus closed his eyes, the dweller rose. They moved barefoot across the cold floorboards, careful to avoid the spots that creaked too loudly. They opened his refrigerator, ate quickly in the dim light of the kitchen, perhaps even sat in his chair, perhaps even stared at the walls as though trying to remember what it was like to belong in a place. Then, before dawn, they retreated, replacing the board, vanishing into the dark. The thought of such a parallel existence, of someone living so closely intertwined with his own life without his knowledge, made Marcus's skin crawl. He began to notice more details. Once, he found the remote control for the television slightly askew, lying at an angle he never left it. Another morning, a book he had left face down on the arm of the couch was instead closed neatly on the table. The intruder was not just surviving in his house. They were living in it, touching his belongings, moving through his routines as if they too belonged here. Each revelation drew Marcus deeper into a fog of unease. Sleep became almost impossible. He locked his bedroom door each night, but the thin wood and brass knob did little to reassure him. He lay awake, listening for the faintest sound, wondering if the dweller was even then creeping through his rooms. Sometimes he thought he heard the boards shift, the whisper of movement outside his door. But when he rose to check, the house always stood still, silent and deceptive as ever. He tried to imagine the face of this hidden resident. In his mind, it shifted constantly. Sometimes a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, sometimes a feral woman with wild hair, sometimes even a child. He wondered if they watched him as he moved about the house, memorizing his patterns, waiting for the moment he left a crumb or a drop of milk for them to take. He wondered if they resented him for claiming the house as his own, or if they saw him as nothing more than a nuisance to be tolerated. One evening, he returned home and found the faint smell of cooking in the air, though he had eaten out in town. His stomach twisted. He opened the refrigerator and saw that a package of eggs was lighter than before, 2 of them gone. He closed the door slowly, the smell still lingering, and realized that he was breathing the same air as someone who had only recently stood in this very spot. The walls seemed to close in around him, the kitchen suddenly small and stifling. He wanted to confront them, to rip open the hatch and drag the dweller into the light. Yet a part of him hesitated. Whoever this was, they had managed to remain undetected for so long, to slip so easily between his life and theirs, that Marcus feared they might be more dangerous than they appeared. What if he startled them, cornered them, and they lashed out? He was not a fighter. He had never even been in a serious altercation in his life. The thought of descending those stairs again unarmed filled him with dread. And so he waited. He watched. He let the intruder's pattern reveal itself piece by piece. He came to understand that the dweller depended on him, that his presence in the house gave them cover. If Marcus left for a day, they stayed hidden, but as long as he returned each night and fell asleep, they knew they had hours to move freely. It was as though they had built their existence entirely around his, like a shadow life tethered to his routine. By now, Marcus's sense of ownership over the house had eroded completely. He moved through the rooms with the knowledge that nothing truly belonged to him anymore. The bed he slept in, the food he ate, the chair he sat on, every piece was shared with the unseen dweller. The walls echoed not just his footsteps, but theirs. The refrigerator door swung open not just for him, but for them. The bathroom mirror reflected not just his face, but theirs as well in the dark hours when he was absent. The realization cut deep. He was no longer alone in his grandfather's house. He was a reluctant host to a phantom tenant who had woven themselves seamlessly into his life. The cold floor of the hallway was no longer just a source of discomfort. It was a reminder, a marker of the line between his world and the one beneath, where someone slept by day and rose by night. A hidden figure whose existence was now inseparably bound to his own. As Marcus sat in the living room late one night, the flashlight clutched tightly in his hand, he realized there was no going back. He had uncovered too much, seen too many signs. The hidden dweller was real, and sooner or later he would have to face them. But for now the silence stretched around him, heavy and alive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the two lives entwined within its walls would finally collide. The nights had grown unbearable. Marcus found himself pacing his bedroom before attempting to sleep, locking and unlocking the door more than once, checking the windows, leaving small traps around the house like a man driven half-mad by suspicion. He could not relax. Not when he knew that as soon as his eyes closed and his breathing slowed, the hidden dweller below would rise from the chamber and move through his home. The tension had wound him so tightly that his muscles ached, his back stiff from hours of lying awake listening to the silence, ears straining for the faintest creak of the floorboards. He knew he could not continue like this forever. A confrontation was inevitable, and each day brought him closer to the moment when he would have to face whoever had made a secret life inside his house. That moment came on a night colder than most. Marcus had been reading in bed, the book open across his lap, though he had stopped following the words long ago. Every few minutes he glanced toward the door, toward the thin band of darkness that separated his room from the rest of the house. At last, with his nerves frayed beyond endurance, he rose and moved silently down the hall. The house was still, but the kind of stillness that carried weight, a deceptive quiet that hinted at hidden movement. He paused in the living room, holding his breath. Then he saw it. A glow spilling faintly from the crack at the edge of the kitchen door. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He knew what he would find before he even pushed the door open a fraction of an inch. The kitchen light was on, casting its pale circle across the counters, and within that circle stood a figure. At first, Marcus thought his mind was playing tricks, but the truth was undeniable. The hatch in the hallway had been lifted, the floorboard set neatly aside, and from it the dweller had emerged. Now the man stood barefoot on the linoleum, his shoulders hunched, his body lean and ragged, the bones of his wrists visible through the sleeves of a shirt worn thin by time. His back was to Marcus. He was busy at the counter, clumsy fingers tearing at a loaf of bread, spreading butter across a slice with a knife that shook in his hand. For a moment, Marcus could not breathe. The sight of another person in his kitchen, illuminated so casually as though he belonged there, overwhelmed every fear and suspicion that had haunted him these past weeks. This was no longer a question of paranoia. This was no longer a shadow or a sound in the night. This was a man, flesh and blood, who had been eating his food and using his house as his own. And Marcus was only a few steps away. He stayed there, frozen, afraid that the sound of his own heartbeat would give him away. The dweller ate quickly, chewing with the desperation of hunger, his shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths. He looked like someone who had not known comfort in a very long time, someone whose entire life had narrowed to the simple act of surviving each night. But the pity Marcus might have felt was drowned beneath the icy flood of fear. This man had been in his house, had crept through his rooms, had stood only feet from his bed while he slept. The violation of it burned in Marcus's chest. His first impulse was to storm into the room, to shout, to demand answers, to seize the man by the collar and drag him back down into the darkness he had come from. But instinct held him back. What if the dweller was dangerous? What if he carried a weapon hidden in his ragged clothes? Marcus had no training in fighting, no experience in brawling beyond a scuffle or two in his youth. If the confrontation turned violent, he might not stand a chance. So instead, he lingered, gathering every ounce of courage, waiting for the right moment. The seconds stretched unbearably. The man finished his meal, licked his fingers, and glanced around the kitchen as though searching for more. Marcus saw his profile then, sharp with hunger, the lines of his face carved by hardship. There was nothing ghostly about him. He was not a phantom, but a man of flesh, one who looked both fragile and unpredictable. Marcus realized with a start that this man had been closer to him than any friend in weeks. He had shared his food, his towels, his space, and now here he was, vulnerable and unguarded, as real as any other human being. A floorboard creaked beneath Marcus's foot, just the slightest shift of weight, but it was enough. The man stiffened, his body tightening like a cornered animal. Slowly, he turned his head, and for the first time their eyes nearly met. Marcus drew back into the shadows, holding his breath, but the man's gaze lingered on the doorway. His hands twitched at his sides, ready to flee, ready to fight. Marcus's fear twisted into resolve. He could not live another night with this shadow haunting him. Tonight it had to end. He stepped forward into the kitchen doorway, his voice breaking the silence. He spoke not with a shout, but with a steady firmness he did not feel, willing his words to carry authority. The dweller froze, shoulders trembling, the loaf of bread still in his hand. Marcus could see the man's chest rise and fall quickly, could see the terror etched across his features. For an instant, neither of them moved. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a sudden burst, the dweller dropped the bread and bolted. He did not lunge for Marcus, but spun in the opposite direction, darting toward the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the floor. Marcus shouted, his voice raw, and lunged after him, but the man was faster than fear itself, a streak of desperation driven by instinct. He shot past Marcus into the dark of the hall, his shoulder grazing Marcus's arm, leaving behind a smear of sweat and grime. Adrenaline surged. Marcus gave chase, his footsteps pounding against the boards, his pulse a drum in his ears. The dweller reached the hatch, his hands already tugging at the floorboard, but in his panic he fumbled and the wood clattered against the frame. Marcus closed the distance, every thought narrowed to one desperate need: to stop him, to end this nightmare. But just as he lunged, the man recovered, slid through the gap like a shadow, and vanished into the darkness below. The hatch fell back into place, leaving Marcus gasping in the hallway, alone once more. He stood there, chest heaving, the sweat cooling on his skin. The confrontation had come and gone in a matter of seconds, yet it had changed everything. He had seen the dweller with his own eyes, chased him through his own house. There was no longer any doubt, no longer any possibility of dismissing what he had uncovered. The man was real, and he was living beneath Marcus's feet, using the hidden chamber and the tunnel beyond as both shelter and escape. Marcus staggered back into the kitchen, the light still glowing, the bread torn and crumbs scattered across the counter. He stared at the mess, at the evidence of a life intersecting with his own, and felt a hollowness expand inside him. He was shaken not only by the encounter, but by the knowledge that the man had been so close, close enough to touch, close enough to harm if he had chosen. And yet he had not fought. He had fled. That alone kept Marcus's mind whirling long into the night, torn between terror and the faintest glimmer of pity. As he sat at the table, the knife still lying where the dweller had left it, Marcus realized that the balance of power had shifted. The man in the basement knew the house better than he did. He had claimed it in secret, shaped his life around Marcus's presence. To root him out would take more than courage. It would take understanding, planning, and the will to face not just the man, but the truth of what this house had become. The time for pretending was over. The confrontation had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. Marcus did not sleep that night. The fleeting glimpse of the dweller, the frantic chase through his own hallway, the blur of a gaunt figure vanishing into the dark beneath his floorboards, all of it replayed in his mind with such sharpness that rest was impossible. He sat at the kitchen table with the light still burning overhead, staring at the crumbs left behind, as though they might explain something, as though the torn loaf of bread and the knife resting carelessly on the counter could speak to him. His pulse had slowed, but the throb in his temples remained. For the first time, there was no room left for denial. The man was real. He had a body, a face, a hunger that drove him to Marcus's refrigerator at night. And more than that, he had instincts, the instinct to flee, to hide, to preserve his secret life at all costs. Marcus's house was not just his own. It had been colonized by another, claimed in silence and in darkness, and that knowledge clung to him like damp clothes that refused to dry. When morning came, Marcus walked the rooms of the house with new eyes. Every corner seemed suspicious, every chair suspect. He opened cabinets, moved furniture, studied the edges of the hallway floorboard as though the wood itself might yield an answer. He thought about sealing it, nailing it down, blocking the entrance so the dweller would be trapped below. But fear held him back. What if the man grew desperate, violent, if he clawed his way out another way? What if Marcus cut off the only means of escape and forced a confrontation that could end in blood? He was not ready for that. Not yet. And so he waited, and he watched. He knew the dweller would return because the pattern had not broken once in all the weeks he had been aware of it. Hunger would drive him again. Thirst would call him back. Marcus decided that this time he would not simply stumble upon him by accident. This time he would be ready. He kept a heavy wrench near his bed, not to kill, but to defend if it came to it. He rehearsed in his mind what he might say, how he might keep his voice calm and firm, how he might wrest control of his house from the phantom life that had taken root inside it. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. On the third night after the chase, Marcus lay awake in the darkness, listening, waiting. The silence of the house stretched around him brittle as glass. Then, faintly, he heard it. The groan of wood, the scrape of the floorboard being lifted. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain still, his breathing steady. He let the minutes pass as he listened to soft footsteps move across the hall, then the click of the refrigerator door. At last he rose, wrench in hand, and stepped silently from his room. The kitchen glowed again with its harsh overhead light. The dweller stood with his back turned, bent slightly as he rummaged through the shelves. His clothing hung from his frame in tatters, his bare feet pale against the floor. Marcus felt a jolt of pity at the sight, but he did not allow it to weaken him. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness. The man froze. His entire body went rigid, the carton of milk clutched in his hands. Slowly, with hesitation, he turned his head. Marcus saw him fully for the first time, a man perhaps a little older than himself, though hardship had aged him beyond his years. His face was narrow, cheeks hollowed, eyes wide and dark with fear. Dirt streaked his skin, and his beard was uneven, patchy, as though grown without care. He looked more like a shadow than a man, yet his expression was unmistakable. It was terror. Marcus gripped the wrench tighter, though he kept it lowered. He spoke, his voice firmer than he felt. The dweller's lips moved, his voice breaking, rough and uncertain. He begged Marcus not to hurt him, the words tumbling out in a rush. He lifted his hands, dropping the milk to the counter with a splash, his posture one of surrender. Marcus's anger flickered, replaced by something quieter. He had expected resistance, perhaps even violence. Instead, he was met with the desperation of someone cornered, someone who feared for his life. He told Marcus he thought the house was abandoned. He said he had been walking through the woods one night in the rain when he discovered the tunnel. At first, he thought it was just a hollow in the ground, but when he crawled further, he found the hidden room beneath the house. He had no home, no family left, no work that would take him. He had been living from day to day, scavenging what he could, and the chamber had seemed like a gift, a shelter from the cold and the danger of the streets. From there, slipping into the house above had been almost too easy. Marcus listened in stunned silence, his chest tight. The man's words tumbled over each other, disjointed but sincere, full of a rawness Marcus could not ignore. He spoke of hunger, of long nights spent alone in the darkness, of creeping upstairs when the silence assured him the house was asleep. He confessed to eating the food, to using the shower, to watching the television just for the company of its glow. He admitted to moving things without realizing, to leaving signs he had hoped Marcus would not notice. And through it all, he kept his hands raised, his body trembling, eyes darting between Marcus and the door as though expecting at any moment to be dragged outside and beaten. Marcus's mind whirled. The story was unbelievable, and yet, at the same time, it explained everything. Every missing slice of bread, every damp towel, every footprint in the dust. This was no malevolent ghost haunting his house, no violent criminal lying in wait. This was a man who had carved out an existence in the cracks of another man's life, surviving where he could, unseen, unheard, until chance and curiosity had drawn Marcus to discover him. For the first time in weeks, the fear that had ruled Marcus's nights ebbed, replaced by a conflicted storm of emotions. He felt anger still, yes, for the violation of his home, for the loss of peace and safety. But he also felt pity, an ache of recognition. This dweller was not so different from himself, a man worn down by circumstances, trying to hold on to something, anything, that would keep him alive. Marcus lowered the wrench, his arm trembling with exhaustion, and the man flinched at the movement. But Marcus only sighed, shaking his head. They stood like that for a long moment, the kitchen holding the weight of truths neither had expected to share. Marcus realized then that his grandfather's house was not just a shelter for him alone. It had become a sanctuary for someone else, someone who had slipped through society's cracks and found a hidden refuge beneath the boards. The revelation was heavy, unsettling, but it was also undeniable. The dweller was not a monster. He was a man. Marcus did not yet know what he would do, what decision he would make. But in that moment, facing the trembling figure in his kitchen, he knew that the story of his house had changed forever. The secrets of the cold floor in the hidden room were no longer mysteries. They were truths laid bare, and the lives of both men would be altered by them in ways Marcus could not yet imagine. Marcus stood in the kitchen for a long time after the man's trembling confession, the wrench still loose in his hand, though his grip had lost all strength. The tension that had been pulling at his chest for weeks now began to unravel, not because the fear had disappeared, but because it had transformed into something else entirely. No longer was the dweller a faceless terror creeping through the shadows of the house. He was a man, battered by circumstance, gaunt from hunger, broken by years of solitude and hardship. Marcus had wanted to hate him, to rage at him for stealing away the peace of his home. But as the dweller spoke, his voice raw with desperation, Marcus could not summon the hatred he had clung to. Instead, he felt the weight of a decision pressing down upon him, heavier than any secret this house had yet revealed. The man stood with his back to the counter, shoulders hunched, eyes still darting between Marcus and the hallway as if expecting violence at any moment. He looked so fragile there in the harsh overhead light, bare feet on the linoleum, fingers twitching nervously at his sides. Marcus's anger dimmed the longer he looked at him. This was no predator. This was no calculated thief come to strip him of possessions. This was a man surviving on crumbs. A man who had found a hole in the world and hidden himself away in it, content to live like a shadow if it meant shelter from the rain and cold. The thought stung Marcus in ways he could not explain, cutting through his fear and igniting something else deep within him. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. Marcus had always told himself he understood hardship. He had seen enough of it in his own life, working jobs that never lasted, watching the walls close in on his marriage until the divorce tore it all apart, drifting between places that never felt like home. But, looking at the dweller, Marcus understood that there were levels of desperation far deeper than his own. There was a kind of poverty that went beyond money, a loneliness that stripped a man of his very place in the world. And this man, this unexpected guest, carried both like a second skin. For hours they sat in silence, Marcus at the table and the dweller leaning against the counter, their words spent but their presence heavy. Marcus tried to imagine his grandfather walking these same halls decades earlier. His grandfather had been a man of quiet pride, hardened by years in the mines but known for his steady hand and fairness. Marcus remembered stories his mother had told, stories of how the old man had taken in strays during the leanest years of the town's history, men injured in the mines, travelers with nowhere else to turn, even children who had lost their way. It had been whispered that there were hiding places in the house and on the land, tucked away not just to store supplies but to give shelter when shelter was needed most. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it all as family legend, the kind of myth that grows up around men who work too hard and ask too little. But now, standing here, he wondered if his grandfather had left behind more than just a home. Perhaps he had left behind a legacy of compassion hidden as deeply in the house as the tunnel beneath the boards. The dweller spoke again at last, his voice hoarse but steadier than before. He told Marcus his name. Gregory, though he said most called him Greg. The sound of it startled Marcus more than he expected. Giving the man a name turned him from a phantom into something undeniably real. Greg explained how he had once worked in a quarry not far from the town, how a collapse had taken the lives of two of his friends and left him injured, unable to work for months. The company had folded, the jobs vanished, and with them went his savings, his home, and eventually his family. He drifted through shelters, then through the streets, until he had nothing left but the strength to keep moving. It was on one of those nights, drenched by rain and shivering from cold, that he had stumbled upon the tunnel, half hidden by brush and stones. He had crawled through it out of desperation and had found what he believed was a miracle, a room dry and sheltered, forgotten by the world. From then on, it had been his. Marcus listened, his jaw tight, trying to weigh anger against empathy. It was difficult to think of his own space being trespassed upon, his own peace stolen night after night. But at the same time he could not deny the humanity in Greg's story. He could not deny the truth written in the man's eyes, in his trembling hands, in the way he flinched at every sudden sound. This was not a criminal scheming for profit. This was a man who had been driven to the edge and who had clawed his way back to survival in the only place he could find. The decision before Marcus now felt unbearable. He could call the police, as most people would. He could press charges, ensure Greg was taken away, removed from his house forever. The thought brought him a measure of relief, the possibility of finally reclaiming the peace he had lost. But he knew what would happen next. Greg would be thrown into a system that saw him only as a trespasser, a vagrant, a nuisance to be discarded. He would vanish again into the cracks, punished for having survived. Marcus felt the weight of that future heavy on his shoulders, and it sickened him. Or he could choose differently. He could choose to help. He could honor the legacy of his grandfather, if such a legacy truly existed, by offering a hand instead of a fist. The risk was clear. Greg could betray him, could use his mercy as a way to take more from him. But Marcus sensed something in him, something too broken to deceive, too weary to lie. He did not see malice in Greg's eyes, only fear and shame. The hours stretched until dawn painted the windows in pale gray. Marcus had not yet decided, but as he looked at Greg slumped against the counter, exhausted from both hunger and confession, he knew that whatever choice he made, it would alter both of their lives. This was no longer a matter of reclaiming his home. This was about more than walls and food and fear. This was about what kind of man Marcus himself wanted to be. In the days that followed, he moved cautiously but deliberately. He called no police, though the thought gnawed at him. Instead, he reached out to the small shelter in town, speaking with the woman who ran it, explaining enough of the truth to secure a place for Greg. When Marcus finally told him, Greg's eyes filled with tears he tried to hide, his body stiff with disbelief. He had expected punishment, not mercy, and Marcus, though still uneasy, though still resentful of the weeks of fear and violation, felt something settle in his chest. The burden of secrecy lifted, replaced by the tentative beginnings of trust. When Greg left the hidden room for the last time, Marcus followed him into the tunnel, flashlight in hand, and together they sealed the entrance with stones and dirt until it was hidden once more. It would never again serve as a passage between worlds, never again open its mouth to swallow or release the forgotten. Marcus felt a strange sorrow as the last sliver of dark was closed, as though he were burying not only the secret of the house, but a part of himself as well. The house grew quieter in the weeks that followed. The food remained untouched, the towels dry, the television dark when he left it so. The silence returned, but it was no longer oppressive. It was his own again. Marcus found himself drawn to the hidden room, now emptied of Greg's few possessions, and decided he could not leave it to rot. He cleaned it slowly, brushing away the cobwebs, discarding the ruined furniture, scrubbing the walls until they no longer reeked of mildew. In time, he transformed it into something new, a refuge for himself, a place to retreat to when the world above felt too heavy. He filled it with tools, with books, with a chair that did not wobble and a lamp that burned steady. It became his sanctuary, a space reclaimed not through fear but through choice. And yet, Marcus never forgot Greg. They kept in touch, cautious at first but gradually warmer. Marcus visited the shelter, brought him meals when he could, and watched as Greg began to stitch together the ragged pieces of his life. Months later, when Greg secured work and found a small place of his own, he returned to Marcus's door with money saved from his wages. He insisted on giving some of it to Marcus, repayment for the food, the towels, the nights spent hidden below. Marcus refused at first, but Greg's eyes, steady now and no longer filled with fear, did not waver. To deny him would be to deny his dignity, his choice to make amends. At last, Marcus accepted, and with the money he bought the last piece needed for his refuge, a wide, bright screen that lit the hidden room with a glow not of secrecy, but of comfort. In time, Marcus no longer thought of the hallway floor as cold. He thought of it as a reminder of what had once been hidden beneath, of the shadow life that had intersected with his own. It reminded him that mercy had costs, but also rewards, that compassion could reshape not only the life of another, but the course of one's own fate. The house was still his, yes, but it was no longer merely a place of solitude. It was a testament to the choices he had made, the legacy he had chosen to honor. And in that knowledge, Marcus finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next shocking twist. Up next, watch more unbelievable stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And share this video with your friends. You won't believe how many people will be stunned by what happens here.